Welcome to Little Steps, Big Gains. In this video, we are going to talk about the role of the vestibular system on our balance and postural control in cerebellar ataxias. If you find this video educational, please press that like button below. Check out my channel for free educational videos and free home exercise programs. For those individuals unfamiliar with the vestibular system, I have created two videos. One is part one that talks about where the vestibular system is, how it functions, and what happens with dysfunction. And then in video two, I talked about treatment interventions for these impairments. I am linking both of those videos in the description below as they provide a foundation for the content that we will discuss here. So first off, as a brief review, when it comes time for your balance, there are three sensory systems that combine information to the brain so that it can respond and maintain our balance. The first is your visual system. Your eyes are constantly talking to your brain, giving it information about where you are in relation to your environment around you. Second is your somatosensory system. And I know that sounds like a really big word, but basically it's in your limbs and it's a combination of tactile input, like at the bottom of your feet, that tells your brain the pressure of your heels and your toes, and proprioceptive input, which is the position of your limbs. That information combines for the somatosensory system. I have a video dedicated to this system below if you're interested. And then that third system that collaborates all of that information is the vestibular system. And that is what we are going to talk about here. All right, that vestibular system is located in the inner ear, and it is separate from the auditory system, our hearing system. It is called the vestibular apparatus, and it is located there. And it sends information to our brain about the orientation of our head relative to our body, relative to gravity around us. Three of its many functions include number one, controlling our posture. And this is related to telling the brain about our spatial orientation. Second, coordinating the movements between the eyes and the head. Three, stabilizing our gaze during dynamic movements, which is so necessary for day-to-day activity. Now, when it comes time for vestibular dysfunction, usually it can be categorized into two main sources. Number one would be dysfunction peripherally away in the actual vestibular apparatus in the inner ear itself. A very common example of this is something called BPPV, Benign Paroxysmal Positional Vertigo. Boy, does that sound scary, but it's very common, and I talk about that in the videos below. And this is where we have dislodged crystals that cause fluid to swish, that causes dizziness during head turns. That is an example of a peripheral vestibular dysfunction. Secondly, it can be categorized into central vestibular dysfunction. And this is where dysfunction originates from the spinal cord and the brain. Ataxia is an example of central vestibular dysfunction, and this is because the vestibular system is modulated centrally by the cerebellum. Now, ataxia, that is usually caused by dysfunction in the cerebellum. The cerebellum is a part of the brain in back, tucked underneath, and it is responsible for movement, okay? Predicting our movements, correcting our movements as we go, coordinating those movements. Those are some of the main responsibilities. It has more than that, but that is the cerebellum in back. Now, when it comes time for ataxia, there are two things that can cause dysfunction there. Number one could be acquired. Okay, acquired would be something like a stroke, traumatic brain injury, tumor resection, something that happened to it. So that ataxia, that damage is not necessarily going to spread, but we have damage in the cerebellum. Now, second would be degeneration there, and this might be an inherited ataxia. There are many types, even some unknown ones still. And this is where in the cerebellum we do have impairments because of a progressive degeneration. So there is a difference between an acquired where we have damage and an inherited where we have a progressive degeneration. All right, so if we have damage or degeneration in the cerebellum, how does that impact our vestibular system? Well, as stated, the vestibular system is modulated centrally by the cerebellum. In other words, when all of that information comes in, the cerebellum needs to organize it. It needs to sort out any conflicting information, and then it needs to alter our response based on all of that information. Therefore, if there's impairments in the cerebellum, it has a hard time doing all those things, processing, organizing, sorting out all of that information, so the individual has a hard time effectively using all of that vestibular input. And this can cause dizziness, postural deviations, balance impairments. That is why individuals with cerebellar pathology have dysfunction in the vestibular system. All right, now we know why, but what can we do about it? That is the big question. Okay, so in part 2 below, I really went through all of the interventions for vestibular impairments, and that is a great video for you to watch because it does provide a great foundation. However, in here, I'm going to briefly go over some of those interventions, and we're going to talk about specifically addressing ataxia with those interventions. When it comes to vestibular therapy exercises, there are a few main approaches. Okay, number 1 is adaptation. So here we practice over and over and over, repeatedly practice coordination between the eyes and the head with the goal that the brain will adapt with all of that practice, adaptation. The approach for this are exercises called gaze stabilization. We will talk about those. That is adaptation. Second is habituation. All right, here we're going to identify the movements that really provoke dizziness. Usually these are things like head turns and positional changes, because remember the vestibular system tells the brain about those things, okay? So let's practice those movements with the goal that the brain will improve its ability to organize all of that information. That is habituation. Now, third is substitution. Hang in there with me, okay? So remember those 3 sensory systems. Remember, we have the visual system, the somatosensory system, and the vestibular system. Now, the idea behind substitution exercises is that if the vestibular system, if we have impairments there, let's strengthen the remaining systems. Let's strengthen that visual and somatosensory system so that they can substitution for impairments there. All right, number 4 is kind of the opposite of that with balance retraining using sensory reweighting. Okay, so what's the opposite? Well, let's take away those 2 things. Let's take away the vision, take away the somatosensory system, and force the brain to rely on that vestibular system. That is another approach. And if you're thinking, wow, this is so much information, I will break it down for you. And then number 5 would be gait training. Number 6 is compensation. All right, so these are techniques that we can use in the middle of an episode of dizziness until symptoms subside. That is a quick overview of all of the approaches for the vestibular therapy exercises. Now, I go over all of those in video 2 below, but after individuals watch it, my individuals with ataxia, they usually ask me 2 things. First, they ask me, are these exercises even effective for ataxia? Number 1. And number 2, if they are effective, where do I begin? Number 1, are these approaches even effective for ataxia? Great question. Let's start with adaptation, that first approach. Remember, adaptation is where we repeatedly practice the coordination between the eyes and the head, with the goal that with all of that practice and repetition, the brain will adapt. Adaptation. And this is done through gaze stabilization exercises, and we'll talk about those. But we're stabilizing the gaze while we're working on our head turns and head position. That would be gaze stabilization. The mechanism that is responsible for this, and this is so important, is something called the Vestibulo-Ocular Reflex. And it sounds so confusing, but it's basically that ability, stabilizing the gaze while we move our head. That is the vestibulo-ocular reflex. And if you're wondering, and they call that the VOR, by the way, vestibulo-ocular reflex. When I say VOR, that's what it stands for. Okay, so then people will ask, well, is my VOR, do I have impairments there? Great question. Check out video 2 below, because I actually break this down, how individuals are assessed with their VOR. So can gaze stabilization exercises, are they effective for an individual with ataxia? Based on the research, yes. Let's start with acquired ataxias. As you recall, that is where we have impairments or dysfunction because of an acquired damage there. Okay, in the references below, I have a study that is entitled Rehabilitation of Balance with 2 individuals with cerebellar dysfunction. The first individual had an acquired ataxia from a tumor resection. She was prescribed repeated gaze stabilization exercises in the mix of her rehabilitation. And she found improvements, especially with her dynamic visual acuity, the ability to stabilize on an object during day-to-day movement, day-to-day head turns. Specifically, she found improvements in her visual acuity, her dynamic visual acuity. With 1 hertz of head turns, she improved from 20/40 to 20/20. And then at 2 hertz, which is a little bit faster, she found improvements in that visual acuity from 20/70 to 20/30, which significantly can improve our function. Another study below, one of my favorites, is called the effects of gaze stabilization alongside proprioceptive training to improve balance with individuals with cerebellar ataxias. Now, in this study, they had 2 groups. One group did proprioceptive training, proprioceptive exercises for balance. The second group did those, but they added gaze stabilization alongside of it. Now, the first exciting thing is both groups found improvements, showing that proprioceptive training is effective for ataxia. But second, the group that added gaze stabilization had greater results, which is exciting to add gaze stabilization. The one thing that the study did not differentiate is if these individuals had acquired or inherited ataxias. It just said that they were clinically diagnosed with cerebellar ataxia. And third below is a female that was admitted to a subacute rehabilitation facility with a cerebellar stroke acquired. She was prescribed adaptation and habituation exercises and found improvements in her balance and gait. All right, so that's for acquired ataxias. But what about inherited degenerative ataxias? Well, based on the research, yes, it can be effective. So below in the resources, I have a case study, and it is called Gaze Stabilization Exercises to Decrease Fall Rate in an Individual with Inherited Cerebellar Atrophy. So this 76-year-old female was prescribed gaze stabilization exercises for 7 weeks, 3 times a day. And through those exercises, she found a 78.6 decrease in fall rates in 1 week. And then on top of that, she found an 89.3% decrease in fall rate at discharge. Final conclusions from this study include: 1, gaze stabilization designed to adapt to the VOR produced meaningful functional results in a patient with hereditary cerebellar atrophy. 2, home vestibular therapy was feasible and safe for a patient with this disorder. 3, this treatment may be considered by therapists for patients with hereditary cerebellar atrophy and deficits in gaze stabilization. And with no standard medical treatment for this disorder, therapy may offer functional improvement. Now, of course, with the limited research, we can't say that gaze stabilization exercises are effective for everybody with an inherited ataxia because there's so many different types. However, it can be a safe modality to add to your current exercise program. Now, I'm the kind of person that wants to know how. How do these changes take place? Well, a few studies. One study below showed that Purkinje cells, these are nerve cells inside the cerebellum, can change their eye position, eye velocity, and head velocity sensitivities after learning. Another exciting study below showed that when it comes time for motor learning, information initially learned inside the cerebellum can be transferred and expressed in other areas of the brain, like the brainstem. So this means that yes, we may have damage or degeneration in the cerebellum, but with exercise and activity, other parts of the brain can actually take over those roles. Now, because research is limited, we can't say that gaze stabilization exercises are effective for everybody with inherited ataxias because there are so many types. However, the research that I have encountered does show that these exercises can be effective for individuals with both acquired and inherited ataxias. All right, next, how do we do or try these exercises? Well, for you, I went ahead and I created videos of the exercises and I put them in the description below. That way they can be repeated. Now, each exercise only takes 1 to 2 minutes, but it should be done 2 to 4 times a day because we need that repetition. What I usually start my individuals with is VOR 1. Remember that stands for Vestibulo Ocular Reflex. The first one, and it's where we stabilize our gaze, right? Gaze stabilization, while we turn our head side to side. I have that below. Now, for my individuals who have cerebellar ataxias, I add one more to start with, and it's actually VOR, Vestibulo-Ocular Reflex, cancellation, because we actually also need to learn how to suppress the VOR, and that is impaired with cerebellar ataxias. And so for this, I have a video below. We're actually turning our head and our eyes to follow that target. And if this also sounds like a lot, I actually put together a list, a summary of recommendations for individuals with cerebellar ataxias, a summary in the description below. Well, that's adaptation exercises, but what about those other vestibular therapy approaches? Remember habituation, repeatedly practicing those movements that elicit dizziness? What about that balance retraining, sensory reweighting, and gait training? Are those effective? Yes. Because we're limited on time, let's go back to 2 of the studies that we talked about. First off, remember that study on proprioceptive training with cerebellar ataxias? That is a study that supports substitution. All right, so if we're impaired with the vestibular system, let's strengthen those remaining systems. Proprioceptive training, somatosensory focused balance training, and we'll talk about that. Second, let's go back to that study entitled Rehabilitation of Balance with 2 patients with cerebellar dysfunction. Now recall with me that first individual had an acquired ataxia because of a tumor resection. And that person did balance training, gait training, gaze stabilization, and they found awesome improvements in balance, gait coordination, and that is awesome. Now, the second person, they had a progressive degenerative inherited ataxia. Now, for this individual, they really focused on balance exercises to facilitate what is called sensory motor rearrangement. Because remember, the cerebellum is responsible for taking all of our sensory input, organizing it, processing it, sorting out conflicting information. So for their balance exercises, they did things like, let's take away the visual system and force them to use the somatosensory vestibular systems. Let's take away their somatosensory system, feet together, balance pads, force them to use these systems. How about we challenge their vestibular system, have them do things like head turns, positional changes, all sorts of exercises like that. And what they found is that this individual was better able to more efficiently utilize all of that sensory input. Exciting conclusions found include many studies now support the idea that cerebellar circuits are modified by experience and that these changes are important for motor learning. Therefore, if the cerebellum is not totally destroyed, adaptation or compensation for the impairments produced appear to occur perhaps in a neighboring area of the cerebellum or in another part of the brain. So how do I apply this information? Well, first and foremost, do not give up on balance training. Things like Tai Chi, yoga, Pilates can challenge the somatosensory system, and I included an entire video on that system in the description below. Secondly, if anyone's interested, I had a patient with an acquired ataxia. By discharge, I started creating balance videos for him, challenging these systems to promote sensory motor rearrangement. I had him do things like head turns, eyes closed, positional changes, and I turned it into a 30-day challenge, and I'm including a link of that program in the description below for anyone interested. Finally, before we conclude, let's touch on compensation. These are techniques an individual can use in the middle of an episode of dizziness until their symptoms subside. This includes fixating your eyes on a target, avoid head movements, extraneous positional changes. Or 2, close your eyes and fixate on an imaginary target as well. 3, increase your proprioceptive input. Really press your arms through the walker, lean back on a chair, lean on a wall. Give the brain extra proprioceptive input to help organize all of that conflicting information. In conclusion, research does support the efficacy of vestibular therapy exercises and interventions with various cerebellar pathologies. Now, if this was so much information, I did go ahead and I put a summary of recommendations in the description below just for you. But as a quick review, first off, remember we have those adaptation exercises. Repeatedly practice the coordination between the eyes and the head through gaze stabilization. 1 to 2 minutes, 2 to 4 times a day. I put videos below. Second, pursue balance training. This can include things like Tai Chi, yoga, Pilates. Ataxia experts do recommend physical and or occupational therapy interventions. I would pursue those. 3, you can add habituation exercises to your current program. I went ahead and created another video for you with 7 example habituation exercises, and I put that in the description below for you. 4, if you're looking for a program that involves all of these interventions, you can check out in the description that 30-day static standing balance challenge. That is there for you as well. I truly hope that you found this video educational and or applicable for you. And if you did, please press that like button below. Check out the resources I collaborated for you in the description below. And if you enjoyed this content, check out my channel, subscribe. For you, I have free educational videos and free home exercise programs because together, little steps, we can make some big gains.